To use SQL or to interact with SQL from inside Node, we need to install a new package. And we do that with npm install, of course. npm install, and let me simply bring that up to make it easier to read. npm install -- save, because it will be a production dependency, one which is a crucial part of our application. And the name is MySQL2. This is simply a later version of, MySQL 1, as you might guess, and it allows us to write SQL code and execute SQL code in Node and interact with a database. Now, with that installed, we made one important step forward towards using MySQL. The next step is that we need to connect to our database from inside our application. And for that, I will close my views here and go to the util folder we created in the past. There we have that path.js file in there, which we don't really use anymore. But we can also create a new file in here, the database.js file. And the name is totally up to you, by the way. In there, I want to set up the code that will allow us to connect to the SQL database and then also give us back a connection object, so to say, which allows us to run queries. For this, I'll first of all import that MySQL package and store it in a MySQL constant. So require MySQL2 is the command I need here. And now there are two ways of connecting with a SQL database. One is that we set up one connection, which we can then use to run queries. And we should always close the connection once we're done with a query. And the downside is that we need to re-execute the code to create the connection for every new query. And there will be a lot of queries because we fetch data, we write data, we delete data. Creating new connections all the time quickly becomes very inefficient, both in our code and also regarding the connection to the database, which is established, and the performance this may cost. So a better way is to create a so-called connection pool. And by the way, you can learn way more about this package, its options regarding how to set up connections and so on in the official docs for this tool or for this package. And you find a link to those docs in the last lecture of this module. So to set up such a pool, I'll create a new constant pool. The name is up to you. And I'll use that MySQL object, and there I will call create pool. And there you also see that create connection we could use. Now, I don't want a single connection, but a pool of connections, which will allow us to always reach out to it whenever we have a query to run. And then we get a new connection from that pool, which manages multiple connections so that we can run multiple queries simultaneously because each query needs its own connection. And once the query is done, the connection will be handed back into the pool and it's available again for a new query. And the pool can then be finished when our application shuts down. So I will call create pool here, and I need to pass in a JavaScript object with some information about our database engine, our database host we're connecting to. For that, I'll first of all define the host, so the server IP address or name. And that is localhost because it's running on our local machine here. Then I need to define the username, and that by default is root. That was given to us during the configuration process. I also need to define the exact database name because this gives us access to a database server, but that server typically has multiple databases. And here our databases are our schemas. So we'll take the node complete database here. So that the value here simply is node complete. Now with that, we simply have to enter one more piece of information, and that is of course our password. So here enter password, and then I used this password. You should of course use the password you assigned during installation. This will create a pool, and now I can export this pool, and it will export it in a special way actually. I will call promise here, because this will allow us to use promises when working with these connections, which of course handle asynchronous tasks, asynchronous data, instead of callbacks. Because promises allow us to write code in a bit more structured way. We don't have many nested callbacks. Instead, we can use promise chains. And you will see what I mean in this module, of course. So now we can always import from the database.js file to get access to that pool and to the connections in there. And I can show this as an example by simply going to app.js, which will of course run when our application starts up. And there, let's simply import database, maybe store it in a constant named db, by requiring util database like this. So reaching out to that new database file we just created. This will then be the pool basically, or well, the pool which allows us to use a connection in it. And if I now use this, let's say here, I can run db, and now we got a couple of methods. One of them is execute, which allows us to execute queries. We also got query, but execute is a bit safer, so we'll use that. We can also end it, and we want to end it whenever our application is to shut down, but we don't shut our application down in this case here, so no need to call end here. Instead, we just want to connect or execute a command. And we can execute a command here by writing SQL syntax as a string. Now, of course, that means you need to know SQL. And I will teach you a very basic SQL here in this course. If you plan on using MySQL together with your Node app, you definitely also have to take a SQL course, which dives into all the depths of the SQL language, because that is far beyond the scope of this course, which is of course a Node course and not a SQL course. But what we could do here is we could select everything from products. And of course, we have no products table yet. So let's quickly go back to our workbench. And here on tables, right click and click create table. And this gives you now the table editor. The name should now be products. And in there, you can add new fields. Remember that schema thing? You add fields. So let's work on this and finish this and execute our first little code in the next lecture.